Hello everyone, it's Chow here, and today we are going to talk a little bit about community ecology, so let's get started. So just as a reminder of our levels of organization, we start with the biosphere and then move down into the ecosystem level and then into the community level. Eventually, we can also move on to the population level and then the organism level. Then we can actually move further down into a cellular level, talking about tissues as well. But for this particular lecture, we will be focusing on the community level. So what exactly is a community in biology? Well, a community is nothing more than an assemblage of different populations of various species living in close proximity for one another and also close enough for potential interaction. It also is just merely a group of interacting organisms sharing some kind of an environment. So different species living in close proximity, sharing some kind of an environment while interacting with one another. And that's basically what a community is. So there are many different examples of communities out there, but here's one that is very, very complex. It is, of course, nothing but the leafcutter ant colony. So leafcutter ants are very, very interesting because they don't eat leaves, but they use leaves to grow fungus, and then they eat that fungus. What's really fascinating about this particular community is that there is the ant, of course, that grows and eats that particular fungus. They actually cultivate the fungus using leaves that they chew up. But there's also within that colony a bad parasite that actually consumes the good cultivar fungus that feeds the ants. What's really more interesting is that there actually is another bacteria. So there's actually another organism within the mix, and this organism is a bacteria. It lives on the surface of the ants that ultimately inhibit the bad fungus that kills the good fungus. And last but not least, there is also a yeast on that bacteria that ultimately actually kill that bacteria and have a negative impact on the ants. So this is a very complex community of different interacting organisms in a very, very small scale that ultimately share many qualities that we see in larger, more complex communities that we see within nature. So once again, you have to think about there are different parts of this particular group that make up this community with sort of positive and negative interactions between different species. What's really fascinating then about communities is that we often are looking at energy flow. And what's really fascinating then about energy flow is that only 10% of the energy moves from one trophic level to another. Some of that energy is lost often in terms of things like heat, as well as movement. But ultimately, what's really important here is just knowing that from one particular level to another, from one trophic level, for instance, maybe a producer moving into a primary consumer, 10% of the energy actually moves on. The remaining 90% or so is actually not moved on from one trophic level to another. So we then can move on to community structure. And of course, community structure is organized by these things we call trophic levels. And it's of course based on the source of energy, which ultimately comes from the plants, which derive their energy partially from the sun. So trophic levels may not necessarily be clearly distinct, but is a very interesting and important and useful concept to think about different levels within the community structure. So obviously we start off with something like primary producers, like plants or phytoplankton, and then ultimately move up bit by bit into perhaps a tertiary or sometimes a quaternary consumer, which often we like to think about as the end of the energy line, and these often are sometimes called apex predators as well. And so we can build these different links in the energy step, these trophic levels, and create what's known as a food chain. And this food chain, of course, starts from oftentimes in many textbooks a primary producer and moves its way up into a tertiary and sometimes quaternary consumer. Now, as we know that this isn't exactly completely accurate because energy flow isn't just in one specific way in most ecosystems, so instead of doing just a food chain, we make it into a food web, which links various organisms together and isn't necessarily a direct path. The arrows then are going to be showing the flow of energy. So for example, here we can see this elk here that's being eaten by a gray wolf. The energy flow is from the elk to the wolf. Here we have some plants over here that's being consumed by the elk, and the energy flow is from the plant to the elk. And that's something that might be important to keep in mind as you are moving along in your studies. Excellent. Now, within community structures, we can also use species diversity. This is sometimes a lab that's implemented into intro courses where you can look at the diversity within a certain ecosystem. But what's really interesting about species diversity is that there are kind of two different ways that you can determine it. And we often use a diversity index like the Shannon Diversity Index, which you may have used to calculate species diversity within the laboratory. But there are two components, the first being species richness, which is really just the total number of different species within the community. There's also sort of species evenness, which sometimes is known as relative abundance, and that is looking at the proportion of each species being represented in the totality of the individuals within that community. So we have species richness and species evenness. These are two terms that often like to show themselves up on exams, so it might be good to keep an eye on them as you are moving in your studies. So as you can see, these two different populations here of what appears to be frogs and toads, amphibians, and you can see over here that there are quite a rich diversity here with at least, I think, 1, 2, 3, 4 different species. So richness is actually fairly strong here because you have 4 different species. But over here, you can see that there's a stronger evenness in terms of the values. And that is, of course, shown by the calculated Shannon Diversity Index as a result. So despite the fact that there's similar richness, this one has a little bit more evenly distributed individual species within the population, and therefore a higher H value. The higher the H value, the higher the diversity. So this one is something to keep in mind because richness and evenness aren't necessarily the same between different ecosystems. So that's really all I am going to cover in terms of community ecology. You can also look sometimes beyond that into trophic cascades, as well as looking at individual interactions between specific species in that particular ecosystem. So thinking maybe things along the lines of like mutualistic interactions or parasitic or predatory interactions. But these will be something else that will be likely covered in another lecture, or it's going to be something that you can look up into on your own. And so this is just a question to go over whether you have an understanding of what exactly a community is within ecology. So go ahead and pause the video here and try to answer it. Okay, so I hope you had some time to maybe think about what the answer is. And obviously for community ecology, it is an interacting group of different species living together in some kind of an environment and some kind of a habitat. So the answer here is C. So I hope you found this useful, and as always, best of luck studying, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks, everyone.